Hello, everyone, and welcome to a Chronic Illness Poetry Salon. I'm Lorene Alba, and I'm going to be your moderator this evening. I am a patient advocate for people who are living with chronic illness because I myself have chronic illness and know what it's like to deal with chronic diseases on a daily basis. Today, we have four great poets who are going to be reading from their poetry and sharing their experiences either living with chronic disease or helping others who live with chronic disease. The first poet I would like to introduce you to is my dear friend Tamara Sellman. Tamara recently published this great book called Intention Tremor, which was published by Moon Press, and it chronicles life following her multiple sclerosis diagnosis in 2013. This hybrid collection blends free and formal verse, scientific jargon, experimental prose, and medical memoir in an authentic rendering representative of her voice and vision as a cross-genre writer. She has such a unique voice, and I'm so excited she's here tonight. Tamara, I'm going to send it to you. Welcome.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate you hosting this, Lorene. Lorene and I know each other through working circles as patient advocates. And I'm also really grateful to be with the rest of the panel today in the salon. I'm really excited to be part of this diverse collection of poets who are all sharing their illness journeys through their poetry. So this first poem comes from my new collection, or all three of these poems come from my new collection, Intention Tremor. The first one is a poem that's written in a formal structure called a blitz. And I chose this form to capture the weird tangents our brains will take to make sense of a new diagnosis. So maybe you'll hear a little bit of that frenetic overthinking that happens when you've been diagnosed with something. Diary of a Syndrome, a Hypochondriac's Blitz. I'm gonna need these. Hiding the truth. Hiding a diary. Diary in permanent ink. Diary of symptoms. Symptoms of the brain. Symptoms of the body. Body of knowledge. Body of evidence. Evidence of foul play. Evidence-based. Based on opinion, based on facts. Facts don't lie. Facts on file. File this. File a claim. Claim ignorance. Claim a dependent. Dependent upon circumstances. Dependent upon your survival. Survival of the fittest. Survival story. Story structure. Story of my life. Life force. Life with chronic illness. Illness and injury. Illness and wellness. Wellness center. Wellness plan. Plan for the worst. Plan for the unexpected. Unexpected company. Unexpected pain. Pain in the ass. Pain management. Management of symptoms. Management experience. Experience setbacks. Experience of a lifetime. Lifetime warranty. Lifetime commitment. Commitment heavy. Commitment fatigue. Fatigue at work. Fatigue syndrome. Syndrome actor. Syndrome or disorder. Disorder. Actor. So the second poem explores one aspect of living with chronic illness in the age of Dr. Google, and it's a prose poem. It's one of my favorite forms. It's called The Expert, and that's how it starts. The expert sits online, overstimulated by blue spectrum light, scouring for evidence, though all he understands is purely anecdotal. The first person accounts, the stories from a friend of his sister's boyfriend's boss. He misinterprets clinical studies, decides 2 and 2 equal 5, wonders why science is taking so long to discover a capital C cure. He is not a biologist, but he might be a theologist. He does not know B cells from jail cells, from T cells, from killer cells, from supercells. He thinks the cure is known, locked in a cylinder in a vault in Antarctica, where nobody will ever find it except through an act of espionage. He thinks sick people are the cash cows of the corporation. that vaccines are for fools, that medicine is poison, big pharma, the enemy. But vitamins are miracles, even when they cost you your electric bill. And if you drank special water, ate special diets, performed special yoga poses, the gut biome would reverse itself and eliminate your dis-ease. Our web evangelizer believes you will fall for his friendly profile picture, the posts about his dogs, his misspelled words, and conspiracy theories posted at hours when only insomniacs breed. Who knows who he really is? To be sure, we could all stand to look in the mirror to see who we are and who we are not. I think many people will relate to that, I hope. And then this third poem, let me say that living with a neurological condition like multiple sclerosis means I do a daily functional check-in. Most of the time things are good, but sometimes they're not. So here's a free verse poem exploring what I mean by that. It's called Sideways. Sideways. Yesterday I woke up sideways. Descending the stairs, I use the railings without white knuckles. I don't fear new adventures anymore. My eyes cocked 45 degrees left of center, even when the crown of my head pointed straight up to the chakra constellations that orbit there, invisible. Do my eyes look funny? I asked him. He shook his head. Is my mouth drooping? He answered no. Am I walking a straight line? My eyes at slant noted the floor, found no evidence of ersatz gravity, which I assumed would be the natural outcome of life on the diagonal. You look fine to me, he said. So I sat at my desk and got to work on deadlines. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tamara. Those three poems were so wonderful, and they resonated with me in a couple of different ways. You know, when you talk about a diary and writing things down, and suddenly things become very real when you write them down, and you have to, you know, deal with them in a different way than maybe when you were just thinking about them. And we've all had that friend or family member who means well, but, you know, is totally against quote unquote big pharma. And if you only do X, you'll be fine because my sister's cousin's husband's dog trainer did that and it worked for them. Right. So I just, those stories just really resonated. And as someone who has often woken up a little sideways, and have just been told by the people I live with, you look great, you're fine, just get to it. I can relate to that as well. So thank you so much for sharing those with us. That was a great start, and I would love to introduce our next speaker, which is Julene Tripp Weaver. Julene is a psychotherapist, a writer, and an herbalist. Her third book, Truth Be Bold: Serenading Life and Death in the Age of AIDS, was a finalist for a Lambda Literary Award, won the Bisexual Book Award, and 4 Human Relations Indie Book Awards. You've had so many awards, I can't even get them out, Julene. Congratulations, and we're so looking forward to your selections this evening.
Okay, thank you so much, Lorena. So I'm going to read from Truth Be Bold. Here's the book. And I'll just dive right in. Seeking. I have joined this story, this family, this band played on, this whole household of words to track. Viral load, T cells, triglycerides. Numbers that rise and fall, power to banish me to a dark cave, into fire, or to a royal blue no tomorrow. I entered this story with knowledge, still it came, a surprise, caught in a bear trap, speeding, a ketchup stain transfixed like blood on a soiled communion dress I wore only once. Is there a rehearsal studio to learn to survive? Shakespearean cliff notes? The White Plague took Keats at 25, Such a romantic story. There is so much to learn, then ignore and carry on, like in any life. That first lingering opportunistic infection. Most would love a trip, exotic travel agent who believes everything is under control. But there is so much to do, so much to manage. Got a ticket, a packed bag, your meds, a list from your doctor, a passport. Most countries will let you in. But what happens if you are out of town when that first infection strikes and you don't know what's happening? Everything progresses fast. Let's say shingles, covering half your head, a ball of fire till you can't see out of one eye. Finally home, your doctor gives a prescription, an eye patch, careful instructions. Eventually the raging ends, but the damaged nerves never stop. Neuralgia, a constant reminder you waited too long. Maybe I should not have felt so brave to make my body an experiment, nor let my T cells drop below 50. It becomes harder over time to want to travel with so much discomfort, not wanting to be seen with scratchy red eyes, a forehead that tingles with pain even in the slightest breeze. It is brave just to go out of the house. We live a long time managing skin disruptions, the largest organ on the body, our first defense. We never recover from damage to the nerves, the daily inflammation to scratch, hide, and cover best I can my consequence, despite how I tried to avoid side effects. Long ago, a friend with the same ongoing skin infections, neuralgia, and dermatitis asked me how I lived with it. I explained about skin's large surface area, suggested he focus on the places that are not itchy, said it's not proportional, but for him it was too much. He took his life. I'm still here, itchy, pressing forward. And I'm going to read a third poem that is not in the book, but it was published in HIV Here and Now. My skin that holds me. My skin is not a bubble gum. Pop. It does not blow out with my breath round and big and pink to the size of a planet, then pop, and we all die. No, my skin does not explode. It is not bazooka sweet, more a mild smoked salt. The itch is worse when I try to sleep. Activated, it jump starts, this spot, then that. She means well. A voice. Find the stable skin, a calf or a thigh free from eczema. Rest your attention there. Any spot with no neuralgia, no dermatitis. But this skin wants my nails. Wants my cheap wooden back scratcher from Chinatown. Before she'll eventually calm down, let me rest. A constant crier, like a newborn wanting more, not a calm sea. Rather a restless neonate calling me back to these parts I barely know, bringing me home to my agitated insides. I try to appease. I bring her creams, thank her for holding me, for not exploding. She accepts my offers, the best lotions money can buy. Eventually, she lets me sleep, these miles of skin that hold me. Thank you.
That was beautiful, Julene. Thank you so much. And, I think you really hit on, how hard it is for people to even go out in public sometimes who are dealing with these chronic conditions. I work a lot in the asthma, eczema, allergy space. I myself have asthma and eczema. So I'm always trying to thank my skin for keeping it together, but yet being, feeling isolated and uncomfortable at going out and having people look at you and not understanding what you're going through. And your story, just really again resonates with me. And I'm so sorry for your loss of your friend. And thank you so much for sharing such personal words. It's beautiful. All right, so I'm going to introduce our third speaker this evening, our third poet, Rene Mullen. Rene is a managing editor for a PR firm in Albuquerque, New Mexico, a performance and traditional poet, and author of the full-length poetry collection, This Still Breathing Canvas. His poetry has been featured in Poetry Quarterly, 50 Haikus, a number of anthologies, and the Santa Fe Literary Review. Rene, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, and thank you, Tamara, for putting this all together. This is a brilliant opportunity and awesome for everybody to kind of share their stories. I have depression and ADHD, and as anyone with mental illness or any of those hidden illnesses know, that a lot of times those invisible illnesses can be seen as folks trying to get attention or things of that nature. So the first poem is going to be a prose poem from my book called Running with Scissors that kind of goes over my kind of coming out publicly. I found celibacy from Blades 10 months ago. Nobody knew before or after. That was the point. Pain for self-defined penance flowing out. Let the dark escape just a dollop. I sigh out a moan. Practiced decades on myself, but nothing prepares you for socially acceptable cutting the tattoo. I walk into the tattoo shop, quiver with pride, embarrassment. Man my age coming clean, announcing I have depression, PTSD, codependency, that I self-harm. Brand myself so silence is no longer an option. Promise to fractal ceiling tiles, this open mouth shall never close again. Years of quiet closet carving of flesh to stop pain, now boxed in daylight. I self-described tattoo artist, skin carver nods at my want for a simple semicolon on my wrist. Why your left wrist? He asks as if he already knows. That's the wrist I'd cut first. Draw me a stop sign. He smiles. I picked up drawing and tattooing to keep from killing myself. I swallow hesitation. Funny. Me too. He starts, and at first it tickles, then sears. I close my eyes, moan. He asks, you okay? Should I stop? Mouth open, I answer, I like it. Keep going. First tattoos are never really firsts. Only the first ones you show judgmental eyes. Nothing prepares you for the first time someone sees your dark passenger and does not flinch. If I ever show you a new tattoo, know I fell off the wagon, but I'm still running beside it. This second one also from my book is called Cancer, because a lot of, like I said, the invisible illnesses tend to be overlooked as not real and just in the person's mind. When bodies reject, we call invasion cancer. We blame God, foreigner in our landscape, mass mutiny conquering our vessel, one organ at a time. When brain commits coup d'etat, captures body's flag, claims land in name of depression, we blame sheep for wolf wearing wool. Both violate trust, disable right to breathe. Just because you can't feel the lump doesn't mean it's not caught in the throat. Battle demoralizes just the same, just as deadly, deflating, unjust to know you can't trust yourself. And my final poem is actually not in the book. It's one of my more recent ones called Body in Fluid. A great swimmer, only when buoyancy keeps it afloat. Yet Archimedes knew, when stuck at sea, if they try to take up less space, boats give in to kitchen floors. Earth sees vessels constrict. Depressed pedals can't save sinking feelings. Air thickens around the immersed body with no upward force helping it stay above water. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rene. That was wonderful. I think it takes so much bravery to be able to be one of the people who does have an invisible or what's considered an invisible condition. And, I quote you, and I'm going to continue to quote this, when you said, "This open mouth will never shut again." And I just thought that was that really again resonated with me as most of your poetry is this evening. And I think that's how we find power and strength, is by telling our story and not being afraid to tell our story. And I know many people who travel with buttons that say, "I have an invisible illness," whether it's migraine or PTSD or depression, whatever it might be, to just let people know, like, hey, this isn't just attention grabbing. This is a real thing. And sometimes it's really hard to, when we're forced to self-identify in ways and times that we're not ready to, in order to get the accommodations that we might need, because we are living with an invisible illness. So thank you so much for sharing your story. Okay, so I'm going to introduce our next poet this evening, Risa Denenberg. Risa lives in Olympic Peninsula in Washington State, where she works as a nurse practitioner and volunteers with End of Life Washington. She has published 7 poetry collections, most recently Slight Faith on Moonpath Press in 2018, and Posthuman, finalist for the Floating Bridge Press Chapbook Contest in 2020. Risa, up to you.
There, can you hear me? Good. So I'm going to read some poems from a book that actually is a chapbook that I wrote a while ago in 2013, I think, and it's called In My Exam Room. I wrote it when I first started doing chronic pain management as a nurse practitioner. But before that, I had worked in an HIV clinic. I'd worked in an abortion clinic. I've worked with addicts. So I've worked at the creases of healthcare, and I write. So I'm going to read a few of my chronic pain poems, or poems from this book, In My Exam Room. The first one is Pain. When pain pulls ahead, leaving meaning in the dust, the sort of hurt that binds behind eyes and shouts that you are a rotten nothing, while the world doesn't care a whit and no one is worth redeeming. There comes a moment you would crush heroin and snort it, even needle it, if you had it in your possession. The next poem is your proverbial pain scale. Describe your pain on a scale of 1 to 10, with 10 being no pain at all. 0 being no pain at all, and 10 being the worst pain you can imagine. 0. 0 is a sun-drenched day in August at the shore where you lounge, occasionally glancing at waves that wave back and demand nothing. 1. 1 is a sunbreak on an otherwise drizzly morn, just as the radio serendipitously begins to play, Here Comes the Sun. 2. 2 is a phone call from a friend seeking advice, which you dispense cheerfully while vigorously kneading the knots in your neck. 3. 3 is a workhorse drenched with extreme coffee. After rummaging for Percocet to no avail, you gulp down 800 milligrams of ibuprofen, chased with vodka. 4. 4 is annoying, and you verge on being unkind, but instead you just don't speak. 5. 5 is an incessant round of electric shocks delivered with a branding iron. 6. 6 is a solid iron rod impaled within your spinal column. 7. 7 is a dead baby lodged in your chest. 8. 8 is like nothing you can imagine. 9. 9 eliminates personhood. 10. 10 is. These poems are patient-centered, and so there's a series of them, and this is in exam room 1. The word was circled in red and followed with 3 exclamation points. What is anxiety like for you? I ask. Like something I really need is missing, she says, like rushing nowhere. I think she means the way the past is a tractor beam, sucking then into now. The way a tongue seeks a dry socket. The way loss is a phantom limb. Things go missing without enunciation. Time is propulsive, it departs, stranding us on the platform, neither here nor there. Some details of pain. All the love I have ever given or received has been soaked in pain. So, pain. Memories of longing are the sweetest morsels in my life. At core, the mind is a platform where details are revised. I know, but I don't remember. I know that I remember what is unknowable. When I don't know, I remember others' memories. I remember that I know pain. However, I can't remember it. Exam room 3. She limps in, humming a dirge. She was doing slightly better until last Wednesday when she got jammed up in the sheets, fell out of bed, landed on her shoulder. Her sadness is a scrim I cannot penetrate. A beam of confidence I don't possess lights an image of vertebrae that won't mend. I follow the path she guides me down and spot a scattershot image of neurons that fire and fire at the brain, daily creating more pain. She wants to know why she falls. And where did her marriage go? The last poem I'm going to read is exam room 5, and it refers to things that happen when you prescribe narcotics. You sometimes end up with very angry people, which you do a lot of when you're dealing with chronic pain patients. Exam room 5. After he storms past, fists near my face, slams the door, gunshot loud enough to bring a crowd to my exam room, I go on with my day, ignoring my gnawing core. I know enough about pain's effects to row against its tide with an easy skull. But I won't nurse his habit. On the drive home, I wonder if he knows where I live. Will he show up, already be inside with a crowbar? Now I can't stop thinking about him, his truculent past, his crushing distress, his circadian hardships. Thank you.
Oh, thank you so much. Those were wonderful. It's so important to also, along with people who are experiencing chronic illness, but to hear from the practitioners who are helping to take care of them, like you and Julene. And so getting your perspective is so important. And your poem around the pain scale was so wonderful. I could just see the person, what the person was going through in each stage from 0 to 10. And it's such an arbitrary scale for most people. And the fact that you were able to put words and feelings and give people a real picture of what those numbers meant in their life, I think is just phenomenal, and a whole new way for patients to think about how they can explain, how their chronic condition is really impacting their life to their healthcare providers. So thank you so much for sharing that. Those were really wonderful poems. I'm so moved by all of them, and just kind of really overwhelmed by all of the talent and creativity here with these four poets that I'm speaking to. And I would like to ask you all a question, which is why you choose poetry as a way to express your feelings around your chronic conditions and journeys. It's, again, such a creative and maybe not traditional way to share your stories. Now, most people are blogging and podcasting, and this is just such an exciting way to hear these stories. So, Tamara, let's start with you.
Sure. It's a funny question for me, because it's not that I choose poetry, it's sort of that it chooses me. And I say that as a lifelong prose writer. But sometimes when I sit down to write things, they just want to take on a life of their own. So I have decided to stop fighting that. I did want to say right away that I really loved listening to all of these poems, and they really capture the whole beauty of using poetry to share our feelings and our experiences within our own bodies and our own minds in a ways that is just so intimate. And I think that is the power of poetry when you're going to share your chronic illness journey. So your question is interesting to me because, as you pointed out, I could have just written a memoir, because my book is poems, but it reads kind of like a medical memoir. But I really didn't. And I feel like, because I write across different genres, I'm a poet and I'm also a prose writer, and I write some fiction too. It felt like the book would be dishonest if I only stuck to one kind of genre or form. So I've collected instead some pieces that are prosaic and others which are more poetic. Some are formal, some are free verse, some of are experimental. For me, that's the only authentic way for me to write this very personal journey for me with my MS diagnosis. I do feel like poetry has this way in that kind of transcends what linear prose storytelling cannot. And it cannot understand life in that same way. And I feel like writing poetry also allows me some distance from my own symptoms and disease to sort of turn them around in my hands, like clay, and kind of observe and see. I get to be playful then. I get to illuminate certain realities and make them more accessible to somebody else. And maybe there's like an inborn teacher part of me who wants to shape what my experience is in a way that teaches. I don't know, probably. But it also, writing poetry also gives me this license to rage, and that's also part of my journey. And I don't apologize for being angry about having a chronic illness. But I do say this, I do believe that when you're given lemonades, that you may as well make lemonade. So Intention Tremor, my book, was sort of a means toward that goal. It's, for me, that poetry, that kind of unusual mixture, hybrid mixture of poems and prose together, is maybe a kind of alchemy that takes that sugar and that water and that sour lemon juice and turns into something that's palatable and maybe even refreshing. I don't know, but that's how I feel about poetry as it pertains to me expressing my feelings about this journey that I'm on. So there you have it.
I love that. Thank you. And, I really appreciate that you said, it gives you the opportunity to rage. And people who are going through physical, mental, struggles, we have the right to be able to rage once in a while when we're angry. And I think one thing I really felt during the pandemic was that if people with chronic conditions were not always seen as inspirational and motivational and, climbing that mountain and getting to the other side, right? This kind of culture that we're in with positive influencers and toxic positivity that, that we weren't really seen. Then we're just kind of the pain in the ass to other people, right? We really have to be seen as these kind of motivational, inspirational people to others. Otherwise, we're just kind of a drain on society. And so I love the fact that you use your poetry to rage in a way that is creative and maybe more palatable to others. Julene, how about you? What is your experience with writing poetry as a way to express your feelings, especially around chronic conditions?
So, yeah, well, a couple of things. First of all, I studied poetry. I started writing poetry after my father died, and I think it was a way for me to grieve. And so poetry to me is a way to express emotions, to grieve. And I went back to school as a returning student in my 30s to study poetry with Audre Lorde. And Audre Lorde used to always say, what does the poem make you feel? It's all about feeling. So for me, that's what poems are about. And I was quite a ways, and then I kept writing poetry, and also I wanted to explore other areas. So quite a few years after I learned my diagnosis, I was working in the field. I went to study with Tom Spanbauer's Dangerous Writing. And Tom is known as a wounded heart healer through his writing. And he starts his workshops talking about his HIV status, which just is so vulnerable and so open. And I just, I think that poetry and writing is a way into your deepest wounds. And that's what he had us do in those workshops. He had us write what was most difficult to write. And that really opened up. I was already writing poems about my status, but I wasn't sure. And I never even expected to have a book published necessarily. My first book was about the work because I was an AIDS case manager for 18 years. But then that was a chapbook. And then I really didn't expect to have my personal poems published, but they were there. And then they did get published. When my first editor asked me to send a book about 3 times and I finally sent it, I said, okay, I was ready. I felt ready at that point once it was, and then I was accepted, which I didn't think it would be. I was just like, well, this has to come out. And I think that writing the hardest things to write is a way of healing. It's a way in. So I'll stop there because I've said a lot. But like I said, my work started out private, and it's opened doors for me to share.
Thank you. And wow, you've gotten to study with some of the masters. So that's amazing.
Yeah.
And I'm so glad that you took that step to share with us. Rene, how about you? Again, as someone living with an invisible illness, to really kind of put it all out there through poetry, how has it helped you in your chronic illness journey?
Uh, I think poetry and the way I started was actually through performance poetry. I didn't see myself as a poet initially, but it became a means of expression for me, partly because, like Julene mentioned, poetry is about feelings. It's about emotion. It's about that feeling it gives you. And mental illness, if nothing else, is emotive. But also, it gave me a vehicle for explaining this invisible and often misunderstood ailment. I think poetry, unlike the longer fiction and nonfiction writing, gives you a chance to kind of not only put the reader in your shoes, but also actually make them feel and understand your journey in a way that's both incredibly accurate, but also safe and relatable, even when there's no easy way for a reader or that a reader could possibly even relate in reality. And frankly, it also helped me to move from long fiction writing to poetry because of my ADHD brain, it likes short bursts, and poetry is short, oftentimes explosive in its storytelling, in its single moment pieces, in how it takes and how long it takes to write at least the first draft. And ADHD, which tends to bundle itself with other mental illnesses like depression, can really only function in those short attentive bursts. So I've found both a way to express and to have others kind of understand, and frankly found a form of writing that works better with how my brain functions.
Terrific. Thank you for sharing. And Risa, how about you?
I love to tell this story. When I was 9, I had pneumonia, and it was the first 3 weeks of school, and I was really so sad that I had to stay home in bed. And of the books I had available to me, I had Robert Louis Stevenson's A Child's Garden of Verse. And he has a poem about being sick. And my memory is really bad now. I used to be able to memorize poems, but it's when I was sick, I lay abed and had my playthings at my head. I'm not getting it, but it meant so much to me. And that book was just such an inspiration to me. I've read and loved poetry since then. I've written poetry for a very long time. I'm just grateful that I'm grateful that I'm a nurse and that I didn't do the other route, because it's given me so much, and I'll just say the word, material to work with. Not that I don't write self-disclosive poetry, I do, but particularly in this book that I shared poems from, there are a lot of emotions associated with being with people in chronic pain, or with people with AIDS, or my best friend died of AIDS. I wrote a book for him. It is extremely helpful to have that outlet for putting the feelings into words, into metaphors, into ways of kind of connecting them to other things that exist.
Thank you. And I think we all also, are so thankful that you became a nurse. I think we have figured out in the last year plus how important nurses are for people who did not already know this already. So thank you for all you have done throughout your career, which is the great segue into my next question, about the pandemic and how has COVID-19 and the pandemic impacted your writing life? Tamara, let's start with you.
Oh, sure. First of all, I just want to say thank you to Risa for all the work that you're doing. I know that I believe you came out of retirement to help people again in this last year, and I mean, that's awesome. I have worked in healthcare myself briefly for a couple of years in a not nearly as an intense an environment, and I have a huge amount of respect for everyone that's doing everything they can. So for my part, I write chronic illness columns weekly, a couple a week, for the same company that Lorene works for, so that's how we know each other. The pandemic has made work really intense and busy, and in fact, I had to cut back on some of my work. I know a lot of people were out of work, and I was at the opposite end of that spectrum. I had to, kind of shut down because, like Rene is describing, sometimes there's just too many balls in the air, and then the ADHD kicks in, and then you just lose it all. All these moving parts are really hard to manage. So for me, I had to really allow my brain to rest in order to keep doing this thing that I love, which is helping to write columns that help people with chronic illness. So that was a way for me to take what was given to me through the pandemic and make it a little bit more sustainable. And that was pulling back and doing a little self-care. As for creative writing, my book was accepted for publication about a year ago. So I've spent really the last year either in production or promoting the book in my free time. And I have to say, it's really hard to sell a book right now. especially if you're a debut writer, because we really need those local independent booksellers and the live readings and events that they sponsor in order to sell books. And there just aren't any of those things happening right now. So it's been really hard. I've done all the other things, like the Zoom readings and the virtual open mics and podcasts and online chats with book mavens. It's all been great. Press releases. I just landed a regular 10-minute radio spot on a UK radio show. It's great, but it's really hard. And I say the virtual events in particular are super hard. They mess with my brain function, quite literally. So I have to say no to a certain extent, and always be trying to plan ways to catch some brain rest. So as for generating new work, I really just write in my head at bedtime right now, because there really hasn't been a lot of space. And that's because I've always worked from home, and my best creative writing work doesn't happen where I do my work. I usually go somewhere else to do that. And that's usually a silent retreat or a conference, or I go rent an Airbnb for a weekend. So 2020 was a really rough year for me, because all my plans were canceled, and I couldn't even take my laptop to a coffee house, much less even a journal and a pen, the old school way. So meanwhile, my brain and my heart, my soul really want to write, driving me crazy not to. In the same way that my husband, he's a musician, he's just going crazy because he can't play music with other people. It's just something that we need to do, right? So without that extra space that's part of our process, it's just been kind of an exercise in frustration. So I'm really hoping, I'm feeling like our state, Washington State, is going to be opening up pretty widely by the end of June. And I'm really hoping that I will be able to get out and get some fresh air and space to do some new creative writing. But yeah, the pandemic has really been kind of rough on my writing life. I know other people are writing tons of stuff, they're writing whole books, and that's just not been my reality.
Thank you, Tamara. And, for a while there in Washington State, you guys were ground zero for the pandemic, right? So I'm sure it hit you all, you too, Risa, you're in Washington State, right? So
Yeah.
I'm sure it hit you much harder than maybe some other parts of the country. So I want to mix it up, and I want to go to Rene, because Tamara, you made a good comment, which was, being in person and doing these things with other people is really important. And so, Rene, how has this affected like your performance art and your performance poetry, during the pandemic?
I will say that the performance poetry stuff kind of dried up completely. There were certainly the online events that kind of burst out of everywhere and were happening almost every night somewhere in the country. But as someone who was privileged enough to have a job that allowed me to work from home, I was already doing 6 hours a day worth of Zoom meetings. So then logging off the computer just to log back on for a performance event or a poetry event became kind of painful and monotonous. So I actually kind of dipped away and stepped away from all of that for a while and started focusing on and diving deep into the mechanics of poetry. I was never trained as a poet. I'm a political scientist by trade. Once I found that this art form had actual craft mechanics that elevate words into brilliant poems, my ADHD brain, loved that and started really going to town into that whole body of literature. I read journal articles. My partner is actually working on her MFA, so I've been reading all of the craft books that she's been assigned. And my writing quickly moved into kind of its next phase of experimentation. And yeah, I still hold on to that storytelling and emotive part of performance poetry. Yes, I'm one of those poets that were on the stage first and still am. Things are starting to open up again here in Albuquerque. We'll be doing our first live show on June 3rd, of which I'll be one of the features. I see performance poetry as, a theatrical poem. an easy to digest poem. And poetry is meant to be savored and reread and seen on that page. And kind of long story short, I feel my poetry's gotten better, even though I've had to kind of disappear from the face of the poetry community. And, you know, losing that community for a while, it's a struggle. I'm sure everybody here can relate that, you know, having our community that deeply understands our conditions and then losing that community, it takes a lot out of you and kind of sucks the wind out of you. And it took a little while to kind of come back from that. But here we are starting to do just that.
Thank you for sharing your experience. Risa, I would love to go to you next because as a nurse practitioner, you have a totally different perspective as a, you know, healthcare practitioner, as I've said before, and maybe understood a little more what was happening during the pandemic than your average person. So how did all of that affect your writing life?
You know, I have to say my year was not affected much by COVID, except that I haven't been able to travel and see my family. I did go back to work. I just, when I realized what was happening and the clinic I work with had just stepped up so much, they just immediately started seeing people. When we came around to testing, they set up huge, you know, arenas of testing. So I just went in and did the ordinary clinic work because I love the people I work with, and it just didn't seem right for me not to use my skills. When I'm working, which I've done all my life, I write anyway. I write in the mornings. And I also have to say I've loved this Zoom world. I feel like my books got more attention than they would have. You spend a lot of time going to readings in bookstores that 12 people come to, you know, and maybe none of them buy the book. And I love doing that. I would always go back to doing that. But I got, I think, a lot more opportunities to read and especially opportunities to see poets that I would never have seen. So I've been kind of enjoying collecting Social Security and working. I have a lot of money now, which, you know, I don't say lightly because I know a lot of people are suffering, but it's allowed me to be generous and to look out for some other people that I know that aren't doing as well as I am.
Thank you so much. Julene, how about you? You know, you've mentioned your work in the HIV/AIDS world, which was a whole different type of pandemic, right? So this might be a little deja vu for you, a little, you know, been here, but somewhat different. So how has this pandemic impacted your writing life?
So first, I want to say something about Risa. Risa has written maybe it's one of her 7 books, or maybe it's an additional one. Maybe she's talking about her poetry books. But Risa has written the definitive guide for women's gynecological care who have HIV. And that book was on my shelf long before I met Risa. And so I am extraordinarily grateful for her work with HIV in women, which is rare because we're less and we're spread out. So there's no center for gynecological care that knows about women, but Risa had that experience and she wrote the book that is amazing. So I just want to call that out because I really have appreciated getting to know her over time and learning she's moved, you know, closer to where I am in the Northwest. I also used to be a New Yorker. So anyway, that book's been a lifeline for me. When the pandemic started, I happened to bump into a woman who was starting a writing group called Writing Through the Apocalypse on Zoom. And I joined that group, and we meet weekly on Saturday mornings, and I have been writing every Saturday morning about the pandemic, and that has resulted in 12 pandemic poems being published, which is, you know, and yes, I've compared it to AIDS, and yes, it is another pandemic we're living through. I, you know, went through the AIDS epidemic, they called that, and that was devastating. It was a war that many people don't know and or have forgotten about. But you know, people are calling this surreal, and they're you know, but for many of us who have chronic illnesses, it's not surreal. It's how we live every day. We're careful. We're aware of the environment and what we're exposed to. And so for me, it's been interesting to compare that and to talk with other people who are living with chronic conditions and see how they're handling it. And actually, the poem I'm going to read in the final round is one of my pandemic poems that looks at a little bit of that comparison. So I just have to say I'm really glad that I joined that group and that I had the chance to explore through a writing group on Zoom. So Zoom has been, I mean, I think many of us are getting tired of Zoom at this point, but it's been a lifeline through this pandemic. So anyway, I think that's it. But I'm glad I was reminded to thank Risa for her book.
Thank you for reminding us all about Risa's amazing work, and congratulations on getting 12 more poems published. You are quite the prolific writer. And I think Zoom is a curse and blessing, right? I myself have been exhausted from being on Zoom calls all day long and then trying to do personal Zooms in the evening and weekends. But at the same time, it's allowed me to meet and interact with people that I would not have had the opportunity to do without this pandemic. And I feel like it's, in a lot of ways, has helped people with chronic illness not be so isolated, right? And I think a lot of us have fears that when the pandemic is over, some of this will go away and people with chronic conditions will be left behind. So I hope everyone watching tonight or watches this video afterwards understands that people with chronic conditions, there's ways to include everybody, and I hope we all continue to do that. So I have found all of you so inspirational this evening, and one of my favorite quotes that I would like to share is one from Carrie Fisher, and it's, "Take your broken heart and turn it into art." And a lot of you have already mentioned kind of the healing process, but I wanted to dig in a little deeper and find out how your poetry and your art has helped really, heal from what you have gone through with chronic conditions or helping other people with chronic conditions. Tamara?
It's an interesting timing of this question because, now that we've had a pandemic, there are going to be a lot of people who have joined our ranks. And I don't say that lightly. The long haulers, we don't know what their future holds, but we do know as people with chronic illness that they can look forward to uncertainty and lack of understanding from doctors and from our loved ones and our families and our coworkers and our bosses and etc. And I wouldn't wish that on anybody. And so interestingly, I think that maybe poetry will have a moment. I mean, there's other experiences out in the world right now where poetry is kind of becoming a voice for other people. You're seeing people like Amanda Gorman on Inauguration Day speaking, Brandon Leake, who won AGT as a spoken word artist. I absolutely love spoken word, and it breaks my heart when people divide spoken word from the written poetry, because it's all just, to me, all part of the same. It's all beating from the same heart, really. So as far as poetry healing, absolutely. I feel like when I wrote Intention Tremor, it lifted me out of something I call diagnosis mind, quote unquote. And it's this kind of airless brain space that you find yourself in once you get news of a chronic illness diagnosis or some kind of diagnosis that you don't want to get, which is mostly every diagnosis, right? Where you can lose a sense of hope or purpose or perspective. And you get into this, it's a spiraling experience, probably some anxiety, probably some depression. Writing my book allowed me to carve some raw material out of that experience into something tangible, like to build a tool that maybe someone else could use to manage their own diagnosis mind. I kind of like to think that that was part of the reason why I wrote it. I'm definitely one of these people who thinks that you can write poetry that's very personal, that's both therapeutic for you and can also still be literary. There are lots of people who have this idea that somehow if you write poetry, quote unquote, as therapy, that it's not going to have the same quality. Now, I remember being released from this sort of bond to this old, I think, really worthless myth about poetry not being very therapeutic. Or being very literary if it's also therapeutic, during a workshop I took from Melissa Febos a few years ago. And you brought it up earlier, Lorene, that somehow people think writing about illness or just people living with illness, we can only be heroes, that this writing can only be a tale of heroism, or the opposite, that it's going to be this maudlin woe is me story. And no, those are two just horrible stereotypes. And I hope that more people write more of their experiences living with illness. And I say living with because that's what we're doing. We are living our lives, so that we can debunk this idea that somehow we are just pure inspiration or pure Debbie Downer, because it's nothing like that. Those are the far extremes. So to me, the best writing, whatever form it takes, whatever topic you write about, it really, as we've talked about, it mines these emotional depths, and it reveals something unique that we share among humans, the human condition. So in order to achieve this, what do? You have to poke the beast. You got to wake it up. You have to cry some. You've got to rage, as I said before. You've got to scare yourself. You've got to find the hidden blessings. You got to laugh until your cheeks hurt, because there's so much bullshit and inequity in the world. And that is where the good stuff comes up from the bottom of that tank. So let me tell you, the people who make themselves vulnerable in order to write their stories, that includes everybody in this panel right now, whatever that truth might be, those are some of the strongest, most determined and resilient people you'll ever meet. I mean, hands down. So writing for people who address their illness, it's mutually rewarding in a sense, because while we may be sharing our journeys in ways that are cathartic and felicitous and illuminating and all these things, the people that are reading them have something to gain from them as well. And that can include, people who are entering into, a long haul COVID situation or whatever. So I know that I don't have to read a poem from another person with multiple sclerosis to learn more. I can read from anybody who's going through any kind of suffering. As Risa will point out, pain is pain, and it's something that's universal to all of us. So we have so much we can learn from each other. So absolutely, I think that poetry is that perfect vehicle for healing, and I think anybody can do it.
Thank you so much. Julene, how about you? How have you used your art and poetry to help heal your broken heart and, gotten you through the AIDS crisis? And, I was in college when this came up, so I was very much aware of what was happening, and not to date myself, but, was there through it. And I definitely remember the war that people were fighting. So how have you, used your poetry to help get through all that?
Yeah. Well, I love that Carrie Fisher quote. And when I do movement work, which is also healing for me, and one of my continuum movement teachers, she's a mentor, Susan Harper, the founder was Emily Conrad. Susan Harper once told me the way through grief and suffering is through creativity, to create, and you transform within that creation. And I had another great teacher. I've had a lot of great teachers. I think one of my superpowers in life is finding great teachers. So I studied with Louise DeSalvo, who wrote the book, and I'm going to show it to you, Writing as a Way of Healing, How Telling Our Stories Transforms Our Life. And she quotes the study done by a psychologist, James Pennebaker, who did a study on writing and healing, and she outlines it in this book and she gives her own tips, but it's a really simple thing. It's you write, you sit down in a private confidential space with a pen and paper, or however you want to write, and you write for 20 minutes over at least a period of 4 days in a week, let's say, to find that 20 minutes, and then you connect what happened and what's going on, or what you're ruminating about, or what your illness or whatever it is. You link it to how you're feeling and why and what's going on for you. You link the events and the feelings, and through that process, there comes an emotional healing. And so definitely creativity is so important to healing. I mean, everything I have studied has reinforced that through time. So I just, want to say that that process is there, it's documented, and it's just a matter of taking the time with yourself to sit down and to do it. And I think that is it. The thing that came up for me is just, this is separate, but something that you talked about the pandemic and the long haulers and the chronic illness. Now they're talking about a cocktail, which is what AIDS is. The big revelation that came in 1996 was the cocktail and how we treat it. And now they're saying that about COVID. And, there are so many similarities. So I just want to put that out there too. But my journey through the healing comes from all these amazing people I've studied with, and there's facts that it's based on. So I'll just end with that.
Thank you for sharing. Risa, how about you?
Find that little button. Making art. I mean, I just want to expand that in terms of what can be done with heartache, but also joy and other huge emotions. Includes dance and painting and writing of all sorts, and arts that I'm not thinking of at the moment. So there's lots of ways to put heartache, if that's the moment we're going to, into an art form. And I think a lot of people do it, and people that don't maybe just need some encouragement too. My first chapbook, which I also have here, I was thinking about reading something from it, was written, it's called What We Owe Each Other. I wrote it not right away, but my best friend died of AIDS while I was in New York, and to kind of keep his journey safe, I took his journals. I kept them away from his family, which needed to happen. But I couldn't read them. And then about 5 or 6 years later, I read them, and I was just devastated. That was as much of a heartbreak as his death. And I felt like I wrote these poems to make him alive again. To make him alive again for me, for other people who knew him. It wasn't healing so much as it was making. And making to me is a thing. You make lemonade, you make, and that's what art is. So that's it.
Thank you. Rene, we'll go to you now. How about you?
Yeah, I mean, poetry is one of those cathartic art forms when you're bleeding on that page. And, it's something deeply energizing when someone, especially as a spoken word or performance artist, you get that kind of immediate response from folks of I get it now, or I feel seen, or I feel less alone. And that is both empowering and just humbling when, 20, 25 years ago, had somebody been up on a stage doing exactly what I had been doing, and I got to see that, maybe I would have started my journey of healing, or at least seeking help, sooner. And to follow what Tamara said earlier about stories being either heroine or that failure story, and that dichotomy being kind of a false dichotomy. I have a good friend who's putting out their first collection of poetry, and I did one of the little blurbs for it. And it is, a fairly hopeful journey also through mental illness and the journey from start to finish, but not even finish. But now that the pandemic has happened and the outcomes of pandemic, and they're not in that same hopeful space. And I keep telling them that's still a story that needs to be told, that you did have this moment and that book is that moment, but now you have, the stumble. And I think those stumbles are just as important as the ups and the failures. And did poetry make it so I didn't need medication or therapy? No, but it very much helped me understand me and made me feel less alone, made others feel less alone. And writing is always talked about as a solitary thing, and to some degree it is, but once you share it either through publication or on a stage or on Zoom or virtual meetings, it becomes a communal moment that's shared. And I think that communal space adds this bond and this energy that kind of keeps a lot of us going.
Thank you so much. Those were beautiful answers. I could ask you all questions all night long. So I want to do a time check. Do we have time for one more question, or should we? But we're good? All right. So let's try to get through this one kind of quickly. I would really like to know, how does poetry translate lived experience into shared experiences? And Rene, I think you just touched on that a little bit. So would you like to just dive a little deeper into that? Like, how has your experience just really helped others through the lived experience and those shared experiences that others might not understand?
It was weird because like I said, I was never a poet to begin with, and didn't feel like one. I saw semifinals poetry slam, got hooked. A friend of mine and I decided the next month we would go. And, the first poem I did was about my cutting. And that was when my now ex-wife found out that I was a cutter. And, from that one moment, there was a person in the audience who is now my best friend because we bonded off of that experience. I've had mothers come up to me afterwards and thank me with tears streaming down their eyes, and clearly I'm not a mother, but that that moment, that sharing adds a connection that just, I don't know, it tips the scale in your favor, I think is what it comes down to. And, unlike a lot of other art forms, it doesn't necessarily give you a play by play of the author's experience, but it transforms it into a metaphor that we all can kind of understand. And I think that that those shared experiences may be very personal and very, one off, and they also reverberate throughout the community and beyond your community in ways that us as writers may never know, but know for sure that it adds to somebody else's experience.
Thank you. And I think for all of us who create art, that knowing that it helps other people, it almost feels very selfish, because you really get that reward and great feeling that you've helped somebody else, through your pain and experience. So I can relate to that. Tamara, how about you?
It's funny. I was having a kind of crummy day earlier, and listening to everyone's poems and their comments, and then Rene talking about community, absolutely. It's that sense of belonging to the larger human collective that's going through this crap together, whatever it might be, whatever shade or color it is or whatever, is just enormous for me. It will give me enough energy to do another year of writing, you know, in a climate where it can be really hard to be a creative person. Let's just say, I think we all understand that as creative people. I appreciate it also that Risa brought up dance and there are all kinds of forms of art, including dance, which is not only solitary, but can also be a community-wide effort of storytelling. I liked that Julene brought up these comparisons to the previous epidemic of AIDS and the idea of the cocktail, which is now something that I actually use for treating my own MS. So it's fascinating to me that all of these different experiences from all these different people who have all these different challenges are all relatable to me. And so I think that's how we help each other, is just by taking our lived experience and putting it out in the world. Now, having MS, it's called a snowflake disease because no two people have the same symptoms or the same outcome, and there's different varieties and different treatments, and so you can't compare apples and apples when it comes to MS. And so my lived experience with MS, the symptoms, the setbacks, the costs, the disabilities, or the lack thereof, aren't necessarily going to parallel to the lived experiences of other people with MS. So that being said, sometimes when we're dealing with some kind of illness, usually something we can't control, our energy really is better spent toward responding to any barriers that it may bring for us. And our response is something we can control. So for me, sharing my journey helps give me some relief, but it can also help give someone else some relief too, because I'm speaking a story aloud that maybe they can relate to, and then they don't feel as alone. So there's that community aspect. And, you know, I really do hope to inspire other people to do whatever they can, if they can. Honestly, I don't see any other way forward. You just have to keep going. I don't think there's another choice, at least not for me. Maybe what I write sparks some creative problem solving, or maybe people will learn that MS isn't a life sentence, even though they felt like it was when they were diagnosed. Or maybe they'll see that there is some humor and maybe some hidden blessings in living with a chronic illness. I mean, I don't know. For me, poetry allows me to deliver hope, though, in a way that can be artful and beautiful while being joyful or devastating or instructive or whatever else it needs to be. I'd love for my book to be like this passport to this mindset that you can live your best life in the face of chronic illness. And I believe that for the most part, we have the option to do that. It means we may have to say no to a lot of things, and we may have to reinvent how we move forward, but we do have some control there. And I think mostly I just want to be able to offer insights from my experience that people really can't get from a team of doctors or from the internet, or people who are out there just trying to capitalize on our conditions by selling us medications or sending us somewhere where we're just going to spend a lot of money and burn a lot of hope on maybe something that doesn't pan out. So I don't only write for my peers with MS, I write for anyone who's living with like an injury, a disease, a disability, an invisible illness. I write for their loved ones and their caregivers, or for anyone who really wants to truly understand what this journey is like, maybe in defiance of stereotypes. So that's a hope I can share. And that's different than my own lived experience, but maybe that's the power behind that. I'm just guessing.
Thank you so much. Risa, how about you? How does poetry translate lived experience into shared experiences?
You know, I don't know the answer to that. I'm an introvert. I love the work that I do, but otherwise I'm a very, I just like my space, and I love to write. I get a lot out of the act of writing. But I have to say that over more than a decade of publishing both books and poetry at journals. I haven't gotten a lot of feedback, so I don't know. And occasionally someone will write me and tell me how much a poem moves them, and that means everything to me. But it's very occasional, I have to say. I hope that the poetry that I write has meaning to other people. Of course I do. But so many of the people I know don't read poetry. I don't think any of my family have read my books. So, I guess I'm just saying that I hope it does, but I don't really know.
I think that's a really great point. A lot of times we create art and just put it out there and hope that somebody sees it, that somebody enjoys it, or it resonates with them. That's kind of the second piece, right? The first piece is you do it for you because it's what like you said, Tamara, right? Like writing finds you. We just are writers and we have to do it. And so we put it out there and we hope that it's helpful for other people. So Julene, how about you? How has your work, helped with others with shared experiences?
Well, I think writing is kind of, which has been said. I find that when I do read from my books, it tends to be educational for people. I didn't talk between poems today, but when I give a fuller reading, I will talk a little between poems. And I think that there's a lot of people who don't know the history and don't even know some of the newer facts about AIDS. So like one of that is important now is the new U equals U campaign, where they find that undetectable equals untransmittable. And I like to be out there saying things that the general population hasn't really heard yet, or isn't really familiar with yet. And even some people living with AIDS aren't familiar with some of these or don't quite trust it yet. So to me, it's a communal thing to go out there and to read my work, and at least at every reading, someone will come up to me, if it's an in-person reading, and start talking to me and thanking me for what I've shared and how much insight they had, or that they learned something they didn't know before. So that to me is the communal aspect, to be able to read it and get it out there when I do.
Thank you. And also, when we talk about the AIDS epidemic, if you don't look at history and understand what happened, we are forced to relive it. And I think we have definitely relived some of that during the COVID-19 pandemic. So thank you for being out there and, being on the forefront and letting people know about, the new things that are happening, because HIV and AIDS has not gone away, right? It's still here. And I think the one thing that all of us do in our art is to help reduce the stigma around chronic disease and illness. And as Tamara said, we are living our lives. We have not stopped living. We've made some adjustments, but we're continuing to live our lives fully and with resilience and with all the joy and sadness that chronic disease brings us. So on that note, again, I said I could talk to you ladies and you too, Rene, all night long, but I think it's time for us to wrap it up. I've taken up enough of your time, and to conclude tonight, I would like to ask you all to just provide one more reading, because I just love your work so much, and I'm sure everyone watching would love to hear one more reading. So Tamara, how about we start with you?
Sure. Thank you so much. This has been absolutely wonderful, and I'm so glad that everyone was here today, and glad that we've had this discussion. I can't wait to watch this back again. It's going to be great. So this last piece, let me take a look at my notes here. This is a free verse piece that I wrote as a way of encouraging other people to write their stories. That I used to be a writing coach, so that's just sort of a knee-jerk response. You got to get out and tell your story, and not saying that it's not going to be, that it's going to be easy, because it's going to be hard, and in some cases could be really, really hard, because we have to deal with things like judgment and outing ourselves, like we've talked about here. There's a certain liberation in that, though, that I think we could all stand to enjoy. And if enough of us tell our stories, then we could maybe overcome some of that judgment that happens out in the world. So let me just read this last poem. It's called Visibility. Oh, and I need my glasses. Visibility shines light on the monster in the corner, prepares us for the grief that comes after the loss that hasn't happened yet, but will. The parts of its body are not monstrous. There is no freakish extremity to chronic incurable illness. Giving one's silhouette a name, a face, an outline, color, and texture is not an act of surrender, but ownership. Sometimes the greater miscreation is the one unseen even when the sun is zenith high. To put pen to paper, voice to mic, needle to corpse may appear to animate atrocity. But let's remember, Frankenstein was a doctor first, a mortal who cowered in shadows, summoning lightning bolts for illumination because the privileged refused to invest in more humane inquiry. We are left to the piecework of calamities, stitching arm to shoulder, knee to shin, lash to lid, heart to breastbone, wrapping ourselves in fabric dyed by tears, shed in secret to flesh out worst case scenarios. This is not abomination, but permission to persist. We are not vectors. The reservoir of our mortality can no more be blamed on failures and personal virtuosity than long life can be credited for intentional acts of biology. So cast your deeper, darker shade upon us, but let's not forget. Frankenstein was a doctor first, a monster only second born. Thank you so much for having me today.
Thank you, Tamara. That was fantastic. All right, Julene, how about you? Do you have one more selection you would like to read for us? Oh, Julene, I think you're still on mute.
I'm so sorry. So this was published in Journal of the Plague Year. I've lived through one war. I've had my share of the I am dying lament. I'll not go there with this new pandemic. I've lived through one war, AIDS, worked and lived through death up close. People take risks. Bug chasers fucked to get HIV. That old story. Citizens throw corona parties to get sick, build immunity. They make decisions irrespective of rules or science. Meet with a friend, walk in a park. Conscientious, I will shelter in place within reason. Unafraid. My body's strong despite a retrovirus I've learned to live with 30 years. No known reason why I survived. People criticize those who exercise free will, speak with judgment from fear, become vigilante citizens, fight with store clerks who request they wear a mask. In the Philippines, they shoot offenders of shelter in place. We must ask new questions, find unconventional answers. Remember our history. Listen to those who survived stigma and shame. It's time for massive change before we proceed. Our planet, slow now with clear skies.
Oh, thank you. That was, oh, that one hit me. Yes, that's great. Thank you, Julene. Rainey, how about you? One more selection?
Absolutely. And thank you again for putting this all together. This has been a lot of fun, even though I spent the entire day in meetings on virtual meetings. This has been very fun and good for the soul. And this last one's a relatively short one because a lot of folks talk about having mental health issues or mental illness of one sort or another, and then folks can talk about the end, which sometimes you can get better, but nobody talks about that journey and how hard that is. So this is called in between stutter. Nobody tells you somewhere between I give up and I want to try lives a stutter. The belief maybe you are better off worse, better off not feeling. No need to relearn life. How you get to give up identity built from trauma ash, prayed for on altars of self-deprecation and self-preservation. I've burnt my religion to embers, reborn of my burning, fashioned wings onto stumps, flexed as self-defense mechanisms. Rather than brush dust from my skin, I've tattooed it in, this badge of honor. I am me now. Thank you.
Oh, I am me now. That is fantastic. Thank you so much for sharing. Risa, you and your cat have been two of our stars this evening. Um, so how about one
Yes.
final? So how about one final selection from you as well?
Sure. And I want to thank everyone for the heartfelt readings and answers, and Tamara for putting this on, and just the good work that everyone has done. I went back to work in a clinic where I felt pretty safe, and I wrote this poem, Elegy in the ICU, to all the nurses that are really on the front line. To wake each morning and once again choose to go to work, to grab a cup and a donut, to gown up, reuse your N95, add goggles and gloves, to feel lacking every time a call bell buzzes, to be a hand reaching out to say, stay, to watch the struggle and the surrender, to notify the family, to grip the phone while they sob, to not cry as you remove the tubes, to cleanse the body as tenderly as if she were your own mother, to cover her with a crisp white sheet, her body now groundless as grace.
Oh, beautiful. What the perfect ending for what we've been going through and what we've been discussing this evening. I would really like to thank all of the poets who joined us tonight. Rene Mullen, Julene Tripp Weaver, Risa Denenberg, and of course my good friend Tamara Kaye Sellman, who helped put this on tonight. And I'm going to just once again plug her book because I've just loved it so much, Intention Tremor. And I just want to say that the proceeds of the sale of this book are going to the Accelerated Cure Project. So it's all going to charity. So please, if you want to dive into some really great chronic illness poetry, I definitely suggest you check out this book. So thank you so much, everyone, for joining us. I'm Lorene Alba, and thank you for joining our poetry salon. And everybody, take care.